Good, let's get started. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to this Experts at Work, which is for a session for all members of all three of our networks. And today we're looking at using leadership presence to change your culture during a pandemic. We are recording this session, as you just heard, and we'll pause it when the speakers say the word because it won't be throughout. But welcome to Carrie and Eunice. I'm really glad you're doing this for us. Thank you ever so much. Much appreciated. Carrie Birmingham is the founder of Carrie Consult and helps leaders and organizations to fix messy and complex problems through coaching and consulting. And Dr. Eunice Aquilina is the author of Stepping Into Your Power, which I've read. It's great, by the way, and find out how Eunice helped organise a strike at her school when she was 12. It's an amazing story. I'm just going to tee that up for you, Eunice, because it was fabulous. And Eunice is a consultant working in the field of learning and change. So send us questions and suggestions via chat throughout to me and to everyone. We'll have 5 minutes Q&A at the end. We're going to put you in breakout rooms a couple of times throughout with a couple of very good questions to share with you. But for now, Carrie and Eunice, over to you. And thanks again. If you could, everyone else put themselves on mute for now. And over to you, speakers. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Richard. So we're really delighted to be with you for the next 45 minutes. And when we thought about the topic at hand, so this idea of using leadership presence to change your culture, we decided we wanted to offer you a couple of provocations, so a couple of things to think about. We're going to, as Richard said, create a little bit of space for you to do your own meaning making and thinking about what that means. And then we wanted to also offer you a sort of real life experience of our own to bring to life this concept of leading through your own presence. So that's what we've got coming up. I'm going to hand over to Eunice, who's going to get us started.
Thank you, Carrie, and let me add my good morning to everyone. It's lovely to see you and to be with you for the next 45 minutes. I guess I want to start by just sort of painting a scene, really, and that is what we've noticed in talking to the various different clients, and we tend to work with a lot of global organisations and smaller organisations, you know, who we've been working with over the last 18 months. What they see is that COVID has really shown us that we need to think differently about change. You know, it's really brought into stark contrast this notion of change is no longer linear. It's much more continuous, it's much more uncertain. It happens in a way that we actually can't plan for. And so we do need to look at it very, very differently. You know, we've also noticed that things people may have said in the past that are impossible can't be done, i.e. taking a whole, I had one company that took the whole company and just said, we're not even coming back into work for the next 2 years. They just made a blanket, that's what we're going to do. And still functioned as an organization. We would have said, you know, 3 years ago, that can't be done. And yet they did it. And in fact, a recent McKinsey report has said that 58% of examples of productivity had gone up as a result of working remotely. So we can think about all of these plans that we can make to make changes or to shift the culture or to bring, you know, transform something, but actually they're quite an illusion. And what we need to learn, certainly from our perspective, as what we've discovered, is we need to lean into that uncertainty. We need to embrace that uncertainty, and we need to develop the agility in ourselves as practitioners, be that inside an organization or out, and within our teams. So the landscape is really changing. It is also becoming increasingly complex, it's more disruptive, and it's more uncertain. But also, I think the other thing, we often dwell on COVID quite rightly, that it's been a time of, you know, immense sadness, a lot of, you know, people being struck by it, affected by it. But it's also invited us to see that change can be an opportunity to rethink and renew the organization. For example, going back to my example earlier about how overnight people just moved from working in the office to working at home. Now maybe we're moving into something, again, we may not have even thought about or considered, but the term of hybrid working, where we're going to have a mixture of both. So as you listen to me saying all of this, you might be thinking, so what? What difference does it make? We've navigated this, we'll navigate the next change that comes along. But we would argue that the capacities leaders need to both navigate and thrive in a world that is not only changing, but is ultimately going to be very different. I hear people talk about going back to normal. I wonder what normal is actually going to be in reality. It is going to be very different. The capacities that our leaders who we are supporting lead will be very different. There'll be a shift, we believe, from simply focusing on accomplishing a task to creating a context for people where they can be with the uncertainty, be with the anxiety that creates, but also still grow and change. And I think there's also going to be an increased emphasis away from individual to the collective. And so when we started to see this unfolding, we started to think about, as we work with different organizations, what's required of us? What do we need to pay attention to within ourselves to enable our clients, our leaders, the leadership teams, to increase their capacity both individually and collectively? And it became very clear that it was less about offering tools, models, and techniques, and more about dialing up, if you will, the quality of our presence and how we showed up. We had to deepen our capacity to tune into ourselves. So noticing what was going on for us when we were feeling triggered, when we were being pushed into an automatic pattern, while simultaneously being able to tune into the system that we were working in, to sense into the needs and the dynamics so that we could respond to that in a more intentional way, in a more conscious way, and more wisely. It also meant supporting leaders to remain mindful and alert themselves, so that we were not just inviting them in it for us, but we were also helping them to do it for themselves, so that they could not only pay attention to what was going on for them, they're going to be triggered by the uncertainty too, but also to what was emerging in the wider system. It also meant we have to learn to be able to self-regulate ourselves. What do I mean by that? Noticing when I'm caught in something, when I'm caught in autopilot mode, and being able to shift myself so that I'm not operating. If I'm feeling frustrated from a meeting that I've just been in, how do I self-regulate myself so that I don't take that frustration into the next meeting? So in short, I think what we're noticing and what COVID has really brought into our sharp focus here is that change is changing. And as HR and OD professionals, we see that we need to show up differently to coach and partner the business so that they can lead a very different business in a very different kind of world. And that for us means we need to tune into our presence to enable this. So I just leave you with that as a starting point to perhaps provoke, stimulate some thoughts yourself. Rather than me carry on talking, we'd like you to be able to have the opportunity to have a conversation yourselves about, what does this mean? What is this? What sense am I making of it? Do I agree? Is change changing? And if so, what are the opportunities I think are available to us? And what does it mean for me as an individual practitioner? And if I may, Richard, I'd love to ask you to open up the breakouts. We're going to invite you to go into just a pair and just make sense of, is change changing? What opportunities do you see as we emerge from the pandemic? And what does this mean for you as a practitioner?
Thanks, Eunice. Yeah, absolutely. So we'll just open the rooms now, as you say, and the questions there in the chat. So is change changing, as Eunice says, and the opportunities for HR and OD professionals, if so? Not problems, but opportunities. Right, we'll give you 5 minutes. We'll be back very shortly. Thanks, everyone. Hold on, we got that. Yeah, okay. Bear with me a sec. Okay, I think they're all in pairs. Oh, got one person on their own. Okay.
We've got Alison here, it looks like, Richard. I don't know if it's not been possible to put her in or not.
I think, Ali, you there?
Yeah, hi Richard. I've literally just sent you a message. I've got an actual face-to-face meeting today and I'm just jumping in the car. So I'm listening in. So sorry, I didn't want to leave someone hanging in a chat room. So I've just dropped you a note as I get in the car.
Sorry, just seen it. Sorry, Annie. No worry at all. You keep on listening. Everyone's sorted.
Will be. Thank you.
How exciting, Alison, a face-to-face meeting.
I know. Honestly, it's taken me ages to get out the door though, because remembering things like pass cards, face masks and water bottles is suddenly hard work, and we've done this for 20 years.
Well, and putting shoes on, I think, is the other thing that feels a bit strange, I notice.
I know, it's, yeah, you're absolutely right there.
Oh yeah, note to self, don't go to the next face-to-face meeting in pyjamas. Doesn't create the right impression, I find. I'm told.
That would certainly be an interesting extension of hybrid working, wouldn't it? Did I miss anything, Carrie, that
We're still recording, Richard, just so you know.
Thanks.
We offered a couple of provocations there for you, this idea that change is changing, and asking the question really what that means for us as OD and HR professionals, and what does that really mean for our presence, I suppose. It'd be, given you had 5 minutes just to noodle that question, it'd be just lovely to hear maybe a couple of thoughts from the groups and the conversations you might have had. Who wouldn't mind offering something to the main room?
I'm happy to go. I was working with Helen Adams, and the time went very quick actually. But
yeah.
One of the things that we discussed was around, how technology has just really helped us, and is change changing? The answer, we said yes, absolutely. The opportunities there we felt were about us being able to be more efficient, and to also make sure that helping leaders to sort of, when they're, if whatever hybrid models we get back into, that we don't sort of fall back into the old behaviors. So we've made history in terms of being able to deal with COVID, and let's kind of think about what is possible as opposed to what's not possible, and going back to that safe zone and that safe system, so sort of really trying to challenge ourselves as professionals, and also those people that we work with and support. So that was something that came up, and we felt that sort of the connecting piece, even though for some people hasn't worked, but for some people it has. So for some organisations that's really helped. So that was just a little share from Helen and I.
Lovely, thank you, Bridget and Helen. And it's a really great point, Bridget. I mean, if we come back to the question, what would our presence need to be like with leaders who are desperate to get back to normal? How do we need to be with them in order to challenge their thinking? It's a great point. What would we need to do in ourselves in order to feel like we could have that conversation and challenge them to think differently, even though maybe this new normal isn't what they want, it's not their preference. I think it's a great question. Let's have one other share from the group then. What else do you notice about this conversation?
I'll go.
Thank you, David.
I was talking to Mark. I was working with Mark Ferry, and I think initially we talked a bit about some of the successes kind of related to the removal of power and politics from decision making early on, and how does one continue to keep that at bay? Because going back to the old way of working, where power and politics then comes front and center of leadership again, it kind of can be a barrier to good decision making. So it's kind of thinking about that and keeping the best parts of how leaders have behaved and bringing those forward into the new world.
Great, thank you, David. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for offering that thought into the group. I mean, for some people this has been something they've really enjoyed, and for others they haven't. So how do we help them see the benefits that it's created? And that removal of power and politics is a really interesting insight. Thank you. So we wanted to offer a sort of case study of our own. So we wanted to share with you a place where we've had to pay attention to our leadership presence and really think about the sort of culture that we're wanting to create. So I'm going to just spend a couple of moments just talking about the situation, talking about what we've done, and then really just thinking very specifically about our presence. And then we will pop you back into another breakout just to carry on the conversation you've just started. You'll be back with your partners. So if I think about the task at hand, the complex and messy problem this client came to us with, well, it's not the global tech firm that we mentioned in the original invite, but it's a communications business. And they grow through acquisition, and their main objective is to dominate the market they're operating in. But each acquisition is done pretty quickly. It's often done pretty brutally. And so in human terms, there's quite a lot of confusion, there's quite a lot of fear, and there's quite a lot of overlap. So, quite a ripple effect each time they acquire a new business. The board came to us because one of the things they were noticing is that they couldn't cope. So they needed the team, the people below them, to step up because there were more issues than they had time to deal with. The language we might use is they were asking us to help that group below them be empowered. But if you excuse the expletive, that really wasn't what they said. What they said is, could you get these people to fix more shit? Because there's a lot to fix, basically. So that was the sort of the way that the request was expressed. And they simply didn't have time, or actually in many cases the answers themselves. So many of these leaders on the board had grown up in the company themselves. They didn't have a playbook or some sort of expansive experience about how to do acquisitions. They were making up on the fly, so they wanted to trust the people below them to do the same. They were working off of instinct. And it's an organization which has got lots of quite spiky business leaders. They shoot with their gut. They're thinking quite short term, and they're also pretty assertive about their opinions. So that was the request, I suppose. That was the complex and messy problem where we had in front of us. So in terms of what we did, I don't think there's anything particularly sort of fancy here. We did some diagnostic interviews. We presented a way forward. We ran a 9-month development program, and we really invested in 16 of their most valuable people who reported to the board using sort of input, development, somatic learning, and action learning. And during that process, like many of us, we had to go overnight from meeting them face to face to working virtually and understanding what Zoom was actually capable of. But the bit I suppose we really wanted to dial up today is to talk a little bit about our presence and how we paid attention to it. So I got the phone call for this work because I knew somebody who worked in the organisation, often the way that things happen with consultants. And she phoned me because she knew I could be quite spiky and quite action focused and moved at speed. In my last corporate role, my team regularly took the mickey out of me at Christmas parties about how quickly I could move around the office. And they had actually could do impressions of me sprinting around. So this person knew I could mirror the organisation. She knew that I could match some of their behaviour. But in truth, when it came to the development programme, me mirroring their culture, their behaviour, their interactions wasn't going to shift the things they needed to shift. So in order to be an instrument of change, in order to pay attention to my presence, as Eunice described, I had to be really mindful and alert, thinking about what is it this client needs? What does this organisation need from me? So there were 3 particular things that I was really conscious about. One, I slowed down, and I don't find that easy. So I had to really practice it. In the first workshop, I remember sort of sitting at the front of the room with my feet on the ground, feeling my back in the chair, and really sort of grounding myself to slow the pace down. In Eunice's book, she talks about centering and a practice that you can use to help settle your own body in order to help others. And that's something I practiced. And I shared that with them. So I shared this idea of slowing down and using centering to do that. And some people resisted it. Some people said, we don't work like that. We're an organisation of speed. We're always in 5th gear. Why do we want to slow down? And I just kept my feet on the ground, kept centering, and noticed when I might be moving into autopilot, when I might want to speed up because they were speeding up. So noticing that I might get caught by that and actually making sure that I stayed in a slow pace to invite them to join me there. This client, the second thing that I was really paying attention to is the fact that they were used to being instructed. They were used to being told what to do. And so I could role model, bring to life a different way of being with them. So in the first workshop, I remember quite distinctly that one of the questions that emerged was, why were they on the programme? And it would have been really easy for me as the leader of the programme to sort of get involved in a dialogue about that and to absorb the fact that maybe they should know the answer to that. Maybe that was a failing on my part. Maybe I could have done a better job. But if I did that, I would have been moving into giving them instruction and giving them the answer. So again, how did I practice something different? How did I pay attention to my presence? And so I kept asking questions. Why do you think you're here? What's the meaning that you've made here? And, you know, that's not something they were used to being asked. So some people got annoyed. You know, there was sort of gritting of teeth. There was sort of people holding on to the chairs, you know, but you should know the answer to this. Why are you asking us? Again, I took a couple of deep breaths, reminded them that we were here for learning, and asked the question again, why do you think you're here? And then a dialogue started, a conversation started in the group where they started to understand and think about for themselves. And some people remained annoyed, and I practiced not getting hooked by that, not getting drawn into that. And the third thing is their ability to think beyond what was in front of them. So they are a short-term business. They're always thinking about tomorrow at best, often today. And so how did I invite them to think beyond that? So we introduced them to systems thinking and got them to think beyond, as Eunice said at the beginning, that change isn't something that happens in a step-by-step way. It's not linear. It's through conversations. It's through dialogue. And that we needed to pay attention to what was going on beyond what was happening tomorrow. So we introduced them to systems thinking. And, you know, some people said, this feels really abstract. I mean, that's the polite version of what they said. And they said, this feels a bit overwhelming. I haven't got time for this. What is this nonsense you're teaching us? And so I paid attention to myself and noticed, you know, that I might get hooked into wanting to make it better for them or make them feel better about what we were doing, but actually invited them to notice instead, you know, where is that discomfort? Where do you feel that discomfort in your body? What do you think that discomfort's about? Do you often feel this? Is this something you feel in other places? And how do you work with that discomfort? So if change is changing, we need to notice our own discomfort and we need to invite other people to do so too. So those were the three ways that I was paying attention to my presence to do what Eunice described at the beginning. In terms of the impact, well, actually at the end of the programme, our NPS score, our advocacy score was 9.1. So people liked it, even if maybe they didn't like it along the way. We had reports that leadership behaviours were shifting. So people described feeling more confident. They described being able to choose to slow down. And also they described that helping them be able to deal with uncertainty rather than getting rushed into having to deal with it. And also the board reported that we've been able to create a collective behavioural shift as well, that more stuff was getting done. Think back to the brief, more shit was getting done, which is what they wanted. They'd noticed their team starting to be able to talk about different perspectives, getting beyond what they thought, and maybe being able to think about what it meant for other people across the organisation, because they deepened trust with each other and were able to talk about that now, which meant we could tackle problems that were bigger than the ones before. And less stuff got referred up because they just pick up the phone and speak to their mate who they'd been on their programme with, and they had a language to do that with each other. So a huge shift in cultural behaviour, but also individual behaviour. So there's a little sort of example, I suppose, of us doing this in practice. And I'm going to hand back to Eunice, who's going to just get you thinking again about this.
Thank you, Carrie. So it's lovely to take ourselves back to that story and remember those moments of frustration when they were resisting. But I think the pieces I want to pull out from what you've just said there is maybe, you know, what's required of us in terms of our presence is that notion of slowing down, as you said, Carrie, and self-regulating, not operating from autopilot. really leveraging the collective. And what we mean by that is inviting, asking, creating space for dialogue as opposed to instructing. And then the final thing you talked to us about, Carrie, was this perceiving the wider system. So not just paying attention to what's in front of them, but also what's around them and what's going on in the system around. And so we'd like you to take that back into your pairs and have another conversation. And this time, really to start to begin to think about, having heard this story, what does Carrie's story provoke in you? And in what way can you pay attention to the quality of your presence? And I'm going to pop those questions into chat, and I know Richard will pop them into the breakout session. So what's provoked in you by the story? What do you notice coming up for you? And what might you want to pay attention to for yourself in terms of the quality of your presence? So Richard, if you would again, another quick breakout would be wonderful.
See you in 5 minutes, everyone.
Guys, I'm sorry if I'm causing confusion because I joined late, therefore I won't appear anywhere. I don't know.
I'm sure Richard could find you a partner.
Oh, sorry, I've got you. Yeah, fair enough. No problem at all. Bear with me a sec. There's just a couple who have not gone in. Sorry, Angela.
It doesn't work.
Nice to see you.
Just pause somewhere in the background. My own reflection.
No, you're right. There we are. There's room 1 for you. See them? You're in number 1 as well. Even better.
Okay, thank you.
Ellie, did you want to join the room? You're quite happy where you are. Fair enough. Okay, right, there we go.
You want to pause the recording again, Richard?
I thought I had.
No,
I did try and hit that call button again. And Carrie and Eunice, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. Just as we did last time, as everyone's coming back, we would love to open the space for 2 things, really. One is any reflections, first and foremost, from the conversation that you have just had that you would like to share with the wider group. Anybody would feel they'd like to just offer something in from those 2 questions, be what was provoked and what might you need to pay attention to? Anybody got something they'd like to start us off with? It's always that moment of, shouldn't I speak? Mark, were you going to say something for us? Okay.
No,
I
sorry.
saw your hand go up, I wasn't sure.
That's a stretch.
I'm happy to go, Eunice.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Karina.
Hi, morning all. And I've been chatting with Pippa this morning from PepsiCo, so we've had a couple of really good conversations. So just a couple of things that it sparked for us when you were telling us your story, Carrie. One of the things for me, and I'm sure we can all relate to that story, whether it's board, exec board, our leadership group, I'm sure we've got some examples of that. And one of the things it sparked for me was about leadership impact. What is the impact that our leaders are creating? So they may well be saying we want them to sort more shit, we want them to be more empowered, we want them to be more this, that and the other. But what is our impact as leaders? And are we actually creating that environment, creating that culture? Or are we just saying those words and actually the way that we're behaving or the way that we're leading isn't actually changing at all? Which, you know, that stuff a lot harder. And the other thing we were chatting about was completely relating to those feelings that you were describing in those meetings, certainly around creating that space for dialogue. So rather than leaping in and feeling like we're responsible, that we have to solve it, that we need to fix it, we need to make people feel better, but actually just holding on to that for a while and allowing that to be, rather than that notion of I'm responsible for sorting this, for fixing it. So they were the 2 couple of things that we were talking about.
Lovely, Karina. And if I can just add a couple of things, that whole thing about impact, presence, if you will, You know, that a lot of research will tell us that most of it is non-verbal, and yet many of our leaders will go, well, as long as I say the right thing, I'll have impact, and that's not the case. You know, it's quite the opposite, in fact. And then that feeling of I'm responsible, I need to jump in. That's that autopilot reaction, because we're so trained, especially in the HR and OD community, to, in inverted commas, help or be helpful, that we find ourselves stepping in and we're halfway down the road having opened our mouths and then suddenly realize where we are. And I think what Carrie was inviting us to notice was, how do we interrupt that so that we don't do that? And that's hard. It is hard. You're right. Thank you, Karina. Let's have one more reflection. That was really lovely. Thank you. One more reflection. Anybody else want to add something?
We were talking, and we were a trio. I think we just got put together at the last minute. But one of the conversations, just building on what was said, was also around all of us were interacting with people that were very fact-based. So tech people, economists, scientists, medics, that have been built and trained to work in a certain way with evidence and facts. And this is really getting people to lean into their inner selves, their mindset, look at their behaviors, how they show up, and how we help them. So we're trying to stay back, coach, ask the right questions, hold that space. They're craving data to help support why they should do this. So just be really interested in any thoughts around that.
Yeah, I'm sure Carrie's got some thoughts, but I'll dive in first. Done a lot of work with either medical specialists or, as you say, technical engineers, quite heavy engineering. And it's interesting because you're right, there is that initial resistance. And then it's almost like that domino effect, that you only need a few people to sort of suddenly see the value of it, and then suddenly it just pulls everybody else in. So what I've learned is, how do I sit with the discomfort of it and stay with it, because it does shift. I don't know, Carrie, if there's anything you want to add to that.
Well, yeah, I think we believe in other things that we can't put our finger on, I suppose. So I'm always curious when people want the evidence for something. Well, it's like, we'll try it and see what happens. Just try it. What's the worst that's going to happen? Just give it a go. And maybe that's my activist speaking, but I think we can fall into believing we've got to prove it, whereas actually, I don't know, give it a go and see if it works for you. See what happens. Because they would test. That what we know from engineers and scientists is they believe in hypotheses and experiments. So invite them into that mindset, I suppose, would be my take on it.
And I think just fine. I'm conscious of time, so I'll hand back to Richard in a moment. But I'm conscious that using language like experiment, give it a go, somehow takes the sort of I've got to get it right away from it. They can hold it a little bit more lightly. Yeah, it can be done.
That's a nice way of putting it.
I've just noticed the time, so I'm going to hand back to you, if that's okay.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Carrie and Eunice. I was just going to say, if people would like to stay on, Carrie and Eunice will be here because we had an excellent question actually during the breakout rooms about mergers, which is really about bringing cultures together. So we'll just be discussing that after this sort of formal finish, as it were. Just to mention, we'll send the link round to Stepping Into Your Power. It's an excellent book. Keep sharing on the WhatsApp groups. If you need to go, no problem at all. But if you're still available, the question that we're looking at was it happened to be about a merge, but really it was about bringing two very different cultures together. One that was much more used to planning, one that was much more used to being a bit more creative. Lunacy was it how it was, I think, described, but more sort of creative, should we say? And Carrie, I think you had some thoughts on that you were going to share.
Yeah, I suppose, Alison, I hope you can still hear us. So I think two things I would really invite you to notice and pay attention to is what's ending. So I think in mergers, a lot of energy gets wrapped up in the new and exciting and what's going to be different, but we forget to acknowledge what's finishing, and people end up not being able to complete psychologically if they haven't been able to acknowledge what's ended. So ceremonies or attention giving to endings is really important. So when I've been involved in mergers before, we might host some sort of ceremony, a goodbye party, a goodbye newsletter, a sort of an acknowledgement of what's no more, I suppose, as a way of helping people to move forward. Alison, that would be my sort of first top tip. And it can feel quite counterintuitive. It's not something leaders often want to dialogue about because they're too busy getting excited about the new future. My second top tip for mergers would be an appreciative inquiry into the value of both. So you talked about those two cultures. Whether we acknowledge it or not, usually in a merger, one is bigger than the other. And so the sort of undercurrent is we're taking over, even if that isn't spoken about. And so someone feels like they're losing out. So not only is their sort of organisation come to an end, but also they're being taken over, as it were, by another culture that isn't familiar. So certainly the work I always encourage leaders to do is not only acknowledge what's finishing, but also to get curious and be active in dialogue about the best of both. Like, what is it that being like your current company, Alison, is like? What's amazing about that, and why do you need to keep elements of that? And what's great about the other culture? And how do you actually co-create something that brings both together, so that you're actively showing maybe the smaller company that how they have been is being acknowledged and cared about? Really helps people get involved in that co-creation process, I suppose, would be my two top tips, Alison. And I can see she's heard that, so she's got a thumbs up. But I mean, I'm sure we've got other people in this group that have had experiences, so maybe throw out to any other additions to that thought process, and or any other questions, I suppose, for those of you still with us.
I do think what you were saying applies generally to cultures. I mean, it happened to be a question that Annie asked about mergers, or a merger, but actually it's the whole bringing two very different cultures together. You could be in, you know, a well-established organisation, you know, the more commercial side, the less commercial, things like that. So yeah, I really like those points actually. Did you have anything to add to those points, Eunice? Fair enough.